Hey everybody. Today I would like to talk about Dark Souls. And Dark Souls is one of my favorite games um, for a few reasons, I'd say. It's certainly my favorite action game that I can really think of. I don't tend to like action games that much, particularly like action hack and slash RPG type games, which on the surface is certainly what Dark Souls appears to be. But the reality of it is that it plays, I guess you would say, much more like a fighting game. Except I've never really got into fighting games, so I don't know whether that's a fair comparison, but I've certainly heard that comparison made before. But as great as the combat is in Dark Souls, I don't really think that that's what I want to talk about today. Instead, what I want to talk about is world design in Dark Souls, and particularly in the first game. Because I think that out of the Souls games which I've played, which would be 1, 2, and 3, I never played Demon Souls or Bloodborne, which tends to get counted in as part of the Souls series, even if it's not titled with Souls in the title and the gameplay is somewhat different. But generally speaking, it's a similar type of game. Of those games that I've played, the original Dark Souls has the best world design. Now, you might ask what exactly I mean by world design, because that could be kind of vague. And I don't really mean the story or the setting exactly. What I mean by world design is I mean like the higher order level design. So normally you would have you'd think of level design as just being scenarios where you're fighting different monsters or whatever. What I mean by world design is I mean if you take a series of those levels, how do they make up the overall world of the game that you're exploring? So the thing that makes it so special is the fact that the world design is a echo of the lower order level design in a lot of ways. It's also it ties into the fundamental gameplay of the Souls games, which is about going through the same areas over and over and over again, essentially until you have them memorized, or you build up inside your head sort of a mental model of action, of things to do, right? And usually at the end of an area, there'll be a big boss, and the boss is similar in some ways in that you need to learn its patterns, and then you can get past it, right? So you're developing a sense of mastery over an unknown, right? You're heading off into this world. You don't know what's out there. It could be all sorts of things, and it becomes very clear very quickly. Certainly in the first Dark Souls, that there's sort of a begrudging trust that you have with the game designer, where you know that they're not trying to give you a bad time, but they are going to kind of mess with you a lot, right? Even from the start of the game, where you have a giant boss that suddenly drops into the arena right in front of you with no particular warning, other than there's something written on the ground which says run, and that's sort of the way in which it telegraphs to you that there is a level of trust that you can have in the game design itself, because when they tell you to run, they're not joking. They mean run, get out of here, right? But they also did drop you into a room with a boss without a weapon, right? So how does the world design in Dark Souls echo the moment-to-moment gameplay? Because they both have this similarity in that they're about mastering, and you're rewarded for mastering the space. At the low level, that means simply just making progress, right? But at this higher order level, you kind of form, I guess, what you would call loops in terms of level design, where part of the level loops back to an earlier part of the level. So you were heading off into the unknown, but you also ended up making a shortcut back, right? So you end up creating these shortcuts for yourself as you head out, and some of those shortcuts become quite large, as in the case of a major shortcut that you unlock in the Undead Parish area that allows you to ride an elevator all the way back down to the starting area. Of course, it's a two-way shortcut, so you can ride that elevator back up if you wanted to. So it takes that space between those 2 points, which is quite large, and it compresses it down to where it's actually quite smaller, and by forming this loop, right? And on this, basically you'd say, like, on this end of the loop, it's a lot closer to there than it was on this end. You just had to go the long way around, right? But that relates to the basic core gameplay in the sense that it gives you a feeling of mastery over the whole world, in a way that the later Souls games don't really give you, because both Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, although Dark Souls 3 has a certain level of interconnectedness and loops inside of its worlds, its stages, its individual areas, the greater overall structure of the game doesn't really have that. Instead, just relies on the ability to teleport between bonfires. And it's really not the same being able to teleport everywhere as it is when you discover these, secret passageways and you feel like you were clever and you discovered something, right? Having a shortcut back to the start of Dark Souls 3 really doesn't mean anything to you because you can just teleport back there anyway, right? So it makes sense that they don't have them, considering they have this teleporting ability from the start of the game. Whereas in the original Dark Souls, you had a bonfire teleport, but you don't unlock it until you're probably about 2/3 of the way through the game. And so this gives you a extra level of mastery over the world, whereas the later Dark Souls games just give you that from the get-go. And although that may be convenient for the player, it both limits the sense of accomplishment that you can get by getting to that point, and it also sort of necessitates a change in the world design. By default, you can't really have those kinds of loops because they don't mean as much, or really anything to the player, right? Other than it's nice to have, because the player, generally speaking, doesn't need to backtrack. If they want to go back somewhere, they just warp to the nearest bonfire and go from there, right? You don't have to actually go back through areas that you've been. So having that warp discourages exploration, and it defeats the point of having a really complex interconnected world design, other than it being a dead end essentially that you looped back. So it actually makes a loop back a negative thing instead of a positive thing. I think I can bridge that somewhat into talking about the general concept of fast travel in open world games. And you could argue whether or not Dark Souls really classifies what you would typically consider an open world game, considering I think the genre, such as it is pretty broad, was defined by Grand Theft Auto 3. That's really, you kind of think of that as the quintessential open world game. But the reality is, like, Dark Souls is an open world game, and even like the original Legend of Zelda on the NES was a open world game, in the sense that you could just explore the whole world from the start. Nothing was walled off to you explicitly. It's a little more walled off in Dark Souls because sometimes you might need to have an item to progress somewhere, but or a key or something. But generally speaking, the whole world is opened up. And fast travel is very much this double-edged sword. And I can recall when the instant fast travel thing was introduced into the Elder Scrolls series in Oblivion, myself and a lot of other people considered that a massive step down in terms of, I wouldn't call it world design, but either sense of place, or Kyle Bosman has called it context. But what I mean by that is this feeling that you're in a real place. That took a huge hit in Oblivion by adding this ability to just warp around wherever you wanted to, because you didn't have to actually travel and live in this world the way that somebody who really did live there would. Even though Morrowind actually did have a fast travel system, it was set up in such a way that it had this context, right? You had silt striders, which were these big bugs, and the context was, well, people ride these around, and it's like a big bus or something, except it's carved out of a bug, right? And that context allowed it to be more believable, and even though it was inconvenient from the standpoint of playing the game, you couldn't just get out of your dungeon and then warp back to town with all your stuff and sell it, and then warp back to the end of the dungeon or something, like you might do in the later games. It encouraged you to explore more, and it also just added so much to this rich feeling of being in a real place. Now, I would probably accept the argument that Dark Souls doesn't have a strong sense of being a real place. It really feels much more like a series of levels than it does a real place. But I think it still gains a lot from both being interconnected and not relying on the ability of the player to warp everywhere. So I don't know whether that was like a really, insightful conversation or discussion about Dark Souls. But it's at least a little bit of what I think is important and interesting about the game. Do you like the video? Then obviously you should subscribe to the channel. That's the normal thing, right? Because there'll be more videos like this, and we do some goofy stuff on here too. It's not all serious. And you should consider backing the Patreon that I have. That's patreon.com/mv. There's a link in the description of the video. You can go there, and if you chip in like just $1 a month, then you can get stuff like this early. $5 a month, you get stuff that's like exclusive just for backers, so that's cool, right? And there's a whole coming up, I guess, in 2 analysis series, as I'm getting closer to finishing the second one, where I just go in depth and play a game, and I'm analyzing it as I go, right? So those are cool. If you've seen any of my like witness analysis videos or things like that, then those are nice. Again, I'd just like to thank you for watching, and if you already back the Patreon, I'd like to thank you for backing, and I will see you around on the internet. Bye.